Hello my lovelies, let's talk Elven strongholds of the Second Age. This will be a series of several videos covering all strongholds and kingdoms. Today, let's start with Eregion. The world and the geography of the world had changed after the end of the First Age. The War of Wrath that marked the end of the age had been a catastrophic event for the people of Middle-earth. Kingdoms were lost, mountains and cities drowned in the flooding, and the world would never be the same. I want to start this series of Elven Kingdoms of the Second Age with a maybe lesser known one, Eregion, and its Lord Celebrimbor, as the main event of the Second Age happened in Eregion, the forging of the 19 Rings of Power in the 90 years between 1500 and 1590. Before we get to Eregion and its lord, let us have a wider look at the map to understand the power dynamics of the world in the Second Age. There are four main Elven kingdoms or strongholds left after the destruction of the world. The Eastern Kingdom of Orophar's woodland realm, that later would become Mirkwood in the Third Age with its new king Thranduil, who will take over after his father fell in the War of the Last Alliance. The Nanda and Cinder Elven Kingdom of Lorien, or Lothlorien, near the lower Misty Mountains, with the Cinder elf Amdir as their king. Side note, after Amdir's son Amroth disappeared, Galadriel and Celeborn took over Lorien, but she never claimed the kingship and called herself Lady of Lothlorien. More on that in the Lorien video. The furthest western kingdom was Lindon, ruled by Gil-galad, who de facto was the last High King in Middle-earth and the last Noldor prince that would rule an Elven kingdom west of the Undying Lands. The kingdom was split in Forlindon in the north and Harlindon in the south, and was the home of the survivors after the fall of Doriath. Noldor, as well as Cinder or Teleri elves, settled in Lindon under the rule of the Noldor king, some willingly, some because there was nowhere else to go, but there after the fall of Beleriand in the First Age. Again, more on that in the coming Lindon video. The fourth stronghold west of the Misty Mountains under the rule of Celebrimbor was obviously Eregion, and the topic of our video today. And I know I have forgotten two elven dwellings of the Second Age and Third Age, Rivendell or Imladris, home to the elves under the rule of Elrond, and the Grey Havens in the uttermost west under the rule of the elf Círdan. I would not count these two as kingdoms, though, as important as they are to the legendarium. They were not more than mere cities or city-states, and their leaders did not claim any kingship or titles besides Lord of. So we get a good picture looking at the map of the Second Age that, yes, there were less elven kingdoms and strongholds, with most of the kingdoms of the Noldorian princes destroyed and gone. Nonetheless, we still had four powerful strongholds spreading over Middle-earth, defending the lands from the upcoming evils of the Second Age. We shall also not forget that the Númenóreans of the Second Age allied with the Elven kingdoms for the greater part of that age, so the powers good versus evil were actually quite balanced, if not even on the side of the elves and men and dwarves. Talking about the realm or kingdom of Eregion, we have to start with a big controversy. As you know, next to the Lord of the Ring books and the appendices and the Silmarillion, we have various other sources retelling stories we thought we knew. In the case of Eregion, there's the Book of the Unfinished Tales, for example, that adds to the controversy of the rulers of Eregion and the timelines. I will tell you what I personally understand as canon, but you can form your own opinion what that means for you. Sadly, there is no correct version of the story of Eregion, because Tolkien wrote various versions and changed his mind a few times, but never said this is canon. The Silmarillion in the chapter of the Rings of Power states, "Only in Eregion, which men called Holland, did elves of Noldoran race establish a lasting realm beyond the Eredluin. Eregion was nigh to the great mansion of the dwarves that were named Khazad-dûm, but by the elves had Hodoron, and afterwards Moria. From Ostinethil, the city of the elves, the high road ran to the west gate of Khazad-dûm, for a friendship arose between dwarves and elves, such as has never elsewhere been, to the enrichment of both those peoples. In Eregion, the craftsmen of the Gwaithai Myrdain, the people of the jewelsmith, surpassed in cunning all that have ever wrought, save only Fëanor himself. And, indeed, greatest in skill amongst them was Celebrimbor, son of Curufin, who was estranged from his father and remained in Nargothrond, when Celeborn and Curufin were driven forth, as is told in the Quenta Silmarillion. So, we only hear of the Gwaithai Myrdain, the Guild of the Smith, and their lord Celebrimbor. There is no Galadriel or Celeborn in the Silmarillion version at that time in Eregion. Sauron came around the year 1200 to Eregion after trying to persuade others before or around the same time, unsuccessfully, as we learn from the Silmarillion. Only to Lindon he did not come, for Gil-galad and Elrond doubted him and his fair seeming. And though they knew not who in truth he was, they would not admit him to that land. But elsewhere the elves received him gladly, and few among them hearkened to the messengers from Lindon, bidding them beware. For Sauron took to himself the name Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, and they had at first much profit from his friendship, and he said to them, Alas, for the weakness of the great, for a mighty king Gil-galad and wise in all law is Master Elrond, and yet they will not aid me in my labours. Can it be that they do not desire to see other lands becoming as blissful as their own? But wherefore should Middle-earth remain forever desolate and dark, whereas the elves could make it as fair as Eresia, nay, even as Valinor? And since you have not returned thither as you might, I perceive that you love this Middle-earth as do I. Is it not then our task to labour together for its enrichment and for raising of all the elven kindreds that wander here, untaught, to the height of that power and knowledge which those have who are beyond the sea? It was in Eregion that the counsels of Sauron were most gladly received, for in the lands of the Noldor desired ever to increase the skill and subtlety of their works. Moreover, they were not at peace in their hearts, since they had refused to return into the west, and they desired both to stay in Middle-earth, which indeed they loved, and yet to enjoy the bliss of those that had departed. Therefore they hearkened to Sauron, and they learned of him many things, for his knowledge was great. In those days the smith of Ostinethil surpassed all that they had contrived before, and they took thought, and they made rings of power. We know Celebrimbor started to forge the 16 in 1500, so most likely Sauron, disguised as Anatar, was around in Eregion for a bit more than 300 years. That doesn't mean he didn't go back to Mordor, which he probably did, to prepare his own ringsmithing that happened 100 years later in the year 1600. But 300 years plus is more than enough to corrupt the hearts of the elven smith. The Silmarillion text clearly tells us why he chose the elves of Eregion. Most of them were Noldor elves. They were the elves that loved to craft and create, but they were also the elves that loved learning and enhancing their skills as well as their knowledge. Insert Sauron disguised as Anatar, bringing them knowledge and wisdom, helping them to create like the elves used to in the Undying Lands centuries ago. It is not a surprise that those who seek knowledge are the ones that are willing to bring sacrifice for that knowledge. This has always been the case, not only in Tolkien's world. You also see in the words of Anatar uses he's setting the elves of Eregion up against the elves of Lindon, Gil-galad's people, and even the Valar, when he puts a question out there why Gil-galad and Elrond do not want Eregion to become as powerful as their own lands, and why the elves should not make their kingdoms as blissful as the ones in the Undying Lands. No wonder a conflict between Gil-galad, Galadriel and Celebrimbor was brewing after he spoke the words and seeded mistrust amongst the elves. So let's summarize. Anatar came in 1200, stayed for a bit more than 300 years, corrupted the willing Noldor elves and Smith of Eregion and the Lord Celebrimbor, and tried to rally them up against the Valar and the elves of Lindon. Let's come to Galadriel and the controversy and Eregion now. We have three main versions of Galadriel and her time in Eregion. The big chunk of information comes from the Unfinished Tales and the chapter History of Galadriel and Celeborn. The role of Galadriel changed over time, and she went from actually not existing at all to the second most powerful elf that ever existed over time. Tolkien made many changes to her story, and especially her time in the Second Age is full of contradicting versions of her and her husband. It goes that far as, do they have a son next to their daughter Celebrian or not? In Appendix B to the Lord of the Rings, it is stated that at the beginning of the Second Age in Lindon dwelt for a time Celeborn, kingsman of Thingol, and his wife was Galadriel. And in the notes to The Road Goes Ever On from 1968, so after the publication of the Lord of the Ring books, it says that Galadriel passed over the mountains of the Ered Luin with her husband Celeborn and went to Eregion. From the chapter concerning Galadriel and Celeborn in the Unfinished Tales, we also get this version of events. For love of Celeborn, who would not leave Middle-earth, and probably with some pride of her own, for she had been one of those eager to adventure there, she did not go west after the downfall of Melkor, but crossed Ered Lindon with Celeborn and came into Ereador. When they entered the region, there were many Noldor and their following, together with grey elves and green elves, and for a while they dwelt in the country about Lake Nenwiel. Celeborn and Galadriel came to be regarded as Lord and Lady of Ereador. Galadriel perceived that there was an evil, controlling purpose in the world, and that it seemed to proceed from a source further in the east, beyond Ereador and the misty mountains. Celeborn and Galadriel therefore went eastwards about the year 700 of the Second Age and established the Noldorian realm of Eregion. It may be that Galadriel chose it because she knew of the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. Galadriel had in their company a Noldorian craftsman named Celebrimbor, who was a survivor of Gondolin and a descendant of Fëanor, son of Curufin, fifth son of Fëanor, who was estranged from his father. Over time, Celebrimbor became the chief artificer of Eregion, entering into close relationship with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, amongst whom his greatest friend was Narvi. It is fascinating how Tolkien also lets us know in the text that Eregion, due to the friendship of Celebrimbor and Narvi, became stronger, and Khazad-dûm became even more beautiful than either would have done alone. The building of the capital of Eregion Ostinethil started in the year 750 Second Age. We learn from the Unfinished Tales version that Sauron had no luck with the elves of Lindon, and Galadriel scorned him and his presence in Eregion. He was fortunate, though, that with other Noldor of Eregion, and especially Celebrimbor, who desired in his heart to rival the skill and fame of Fëanor, Sauron used all his art upon Celebrimbor and his fellow smith, who had formed a society of brotherhood that became very powerful in Eregion, the Gwaithai Myrdain, but he worked in secret, unknown to Galadriel and Celeborn. After teaching them the secrets of crafting and magic he himself had learned in the Undying Lands, he persuaded them to revolt against Galadriel and Celeborn and to seize power in Eregion. That was around the year 1350 to 1400. Galadriel therefore must have fallen out with Celebrimbor and left Eregion via Khazad-dûm and went to Lorinand, taking with her her daughter Celebrian and her son Amroth. Note in this version Amroth was her son, that would later be revised to her only child being Celebrian. It is interesting that Tolkien says Celeborn stays behind in Eregion and was disregarded by Celebrimbor, the new lord of Eregion. Imagine elves fighting and scheming against each other. Well, we actually had a very similar situation in Nargothrond, an Elven Kingdom in the First Age, actually the kingdom of Galadriel's brother Finrod. Celebrimbor's father Curufin and his brother Celeborn, sorry for these names, took advantage of Finrod leaving his kingdom to aid Beren and Luthien in their quest to get one Silmaril from Morgoth. The two brothers seized the power from Finrod's brother Orodreth, who was supposed to rule in his stead. So this situation mirrors of what his father did in the First Age, and this version of Celebrimbor is a less flattering one than the one in the Silmarillion. He and the Guild of the Smith, under the influence of Sauron, seized the power from Celeborn, who most likely stayed behind at Galadriel's behest, but also because we know he did not want to pass through any dwarven lands. But let's be realistic, he could have taken another route if he really wanted to leave. But he chose to stay, at least try to control the situation in Eregion and Sauron's influence, I would say. So we have two main differences in the various versions. One is Galadriel and Celeborn were the founders but were driven out of Eregion by Celebrimbor and the Smithing Guild under Sauron's influence, as stated in the Unfinished Tales. And the second Silmarillion version just tells us Celebrimbor was the Lord of Eregion, no mentioning of Galadriel. I personally prefer the version of the Unfinished Tales, not only because it makes Celebrimbor a traitor, and it spices up the story, but it would give Celebrimbor as well as Galadriel a more fleshed out backstory, and give especially the Lord of Eregion a character arc, because he, unlike his ancestor, did redeem himself. He saw his wrongdoings and crafted the 3 elven rings in secret, sensing he had made a mistake. This version is also much more believable, as we know the Noldor royal family had always squabbled amongst each other, and it continued even in the Second Age. But finally they came to realize that there was a greater evil to fight, and they once more worked together as a family. Let me know in the comments what your favorite version or headcanon about Eregion is. Let's go back to Eregion. Sadly, we do not know a lot about the capital Ostinethil or the lands. We know of the location and its borders, and if you look at the map, it was quite a strategic location, and if it was Galadriel in her foresight of befriending the dwarves, or Celebrimbor himself who founded the stronghold, its capital was close to the rivers Sirion and Glanduin. A trade route to the Misty Mountain added to Eregion's and the Dwarven Kingdom's success and riches, and it was close, but not too close to the other elven strongholds, and the Misty Mountains guarded Eregion's lands from Mordor and the rising evil in the east, or so they thought. The land must have been fertile, but we mostly hear of the elves being interested in craftsmanship and less in nature itself. We know some men lived and farmed there though, and even some Dunedain were dwelling in the lands. The realm and its glory days didn't last long though. After Sauron crafted his one ring in 1600, he learned of the betrayal of Eregion and the Smith of the Guild. In 1695, Sauron came for Celebrimbor and the 19 Rings of Power. By the way, I do have a dedicated video on this linked here if you are interested. With a massive force, he besieged Eregion, who were not prepared for battle, nor did their forces match Sauron's armies. My guess is Eregion did not have a strong army. We have no numbers, but I actually think those elves focused more on trade or crafting than war. They did call for aid from Lindon, and Gil-galad did send aid. Elrond was leading the armies, but it was too late and they were not strong enough. Only 2 years later, in 1697, Sauron laid waste to Eregion, destroyed the capital, and after unimaginable tortures finally killed Celebrimbor, his former ally and pupil. Galadriel's foresight as well as Celebrimbor's friendship with the dwarves saved Elrond and his armies, as they surprisingly attacked Sauron, who did not expect the dwarves to aid. Elrond could escape and founded Imladris after being beaten and driven out of Eregion. In 1699, Sauron had full control over Eregion. He set all forests on fire and everyone that could fled the lands. Eregion would never be inhabited again. Its story was a short one, but eventful. It stood almost 1,000 years, which is a very short time spent comparing it to other elven strongholds. Still, the main events of the Second Age took place in this elven realm. Going back to the various versions, my own headcanon is Galadriel and Celeborn indeed were the founders. Galadriel in her foresight knew the dwarves would one day be needed, and therefore the lands and the closeness to Moria would come in handy in times of need. So it makes sense she founded Eregion, and I like the similarities between Celebrimbor and his father. Both were doomed by the curse of the Noldor from the beginning, and they took over lands or kingdoms that were not their own. Curufin Nargothrond from Galadriel's brother Finrod, and Celebrimbor Eregion from Galadriel herself. But just as the curse foretold, their endeavors would lead to nothing and their rule would be doomed. I hope you enjoyed this one. Till the next one. Bye bye, my lovelies.